Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and a warm welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you by Standard Bank here on Moneyweb. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and as you know, South Africa chairs the G20 in a year of rolling shocks, contested narratives and thin global trust. My guest today is Richard Calland, Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town. He is also a well-respected political analyst. And he's argued that the so-called middle powers have got to step up to salvage the G20 and shore up multilateralism. He's also challenged what he terms a sclerotic Europe to reset relations with Africa and the global south. At the same time, the Sustainable Finance Working Group has been on our doorstep pushing leadership development and agenda setting on how to unlock capital for emerging markets. If sustainable finance is the engine room of this presidency, the question, I guess, is whether we can move from design to deployment. So lots to talk about. Richard Calland, always good to talk to you. And let's start with this. Maybe define, for the purposes of this conversation, what you mean by middle power. Who fits, who doesn't, and why does it matter?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy, and I appreciate this conversation very much. It's timely because there's an awful lot going on internationally in the geopolitical space, or the geoeconomical space, as people are increasingly referring to it. And of course, South Africa is the president of this year's G20, a complex undertaking in any year, but especially this year, with the Trump administration playing a very disruptive role in the international arena. Middle powers, therefore, need to step up, is my argument. Who are middle powers? It's not a new concept by any means. It's been a concept that's been around the kind of academic and other literature for a long time. But as the geopolitical terrain shifts, so our definitions of who is powerful and who is not powerful and their relative power to each other, of course, has to adjust. And I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is how so-called developing countries, such as China and India, most obviously, and to some extent Brazil and even South Africa, have stepped into the middle space in that kind of spectrum. What I argued in my Maverick piece was that, in fact, we need to be quite subtle about this, because China clearly is not only not a developing country anymore, it's a major economic power. And it needs to be thought of even as a great power. And the conversations that are going on internationally are really about three quick groups, which I can quickly summarize. The first is the Great Powers Group, which is Russia, United States, and China, jostling for power, jostling for attention, and competing. The second group, which I'm calling the mezzanine level, not quite middle powers because they're too powerful to be a middle power, but not a great power, jostling for full power. And that's countries such as Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and now India. These are very powerful countries, either because of their historical power or because of their emerging power, in the case of India. And then there's the rest, and the rest has two categories: the middle powers that I'm referring to, which are countries like South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, but also European countries like Spain and Ireland, and so on. And then there are literally the rest, and that's everybody else. And most of those other countries are relatively poor and relatively geopolitically weak.
So what does stepping up look like in practice then?
I think stepping up means working together, because the big problem in multilateral relations at the moment is the lack of cooperation, the lack of a consolidated commitment to the norms and standards which have guided international relations over the last 70 years, pretty much, since the end of the Second World War, when a whole new set of institutional arrangements, both legal but also organizations, emerged, the so-called Bretton Woods organizations, such as the IMF, the World Bank, but also the international law treaties that emerged after the Second World War. All of that is under threat, and the multilateralism that is essential to combating the most difficult challenges of our time, whether it be such issues as blood diamonds or immigration or AI and the governance of AI, and most obviously perhaps climate change and how you collaborate internationally to combat problems that are transnational and which see no borders, requires really detailed international cooperation. And when you've got great powers jostling for power and attention and trying to win the game at the expense of others, which I think is where we're at internationally at the moment, it's very hard to have that kind of mature, carefully organized, coordinated action. And so middle powers who have a lot of power, if they work together, I think need to step into that gap and shore up the institutions we need for collective action.
And Richard Calland, it puts a lot of pressure on South Africa. As I hear you outline this challenge, it sounds to me like almost a game of diplomatic Dungeons and Dragons. And I wonder whether South Africa has the capacity, the skill, and even the moral authority to marshal those middle powers towards the destination or goal that you're suggesting.
Well, it's a very fair question. And I'd answer it in this way. First of all, whether it likes it or not, it's South Africa's responsibility to try. And as a senior diplomat from a middle power country put it to me, he said to me, it's South Africa's destiny to be president of the G20 at this particular moment in history. So there's a kind of historical burden on South Africa, whether it likes it or not, to make the most of this G20, to try and find agreement where it can, and to bind those middle powers to mitigate against the risks of the elephants trampling the ground, the great powers that I've referred to. And the other thing on your, I think, yes, very fair question about South Africa's legitimacy in this space. The veteran political scientist and international affairs writer Garth Philip-Pierre has a piece coming out about middle powers in which he talks specifically about this question of legitimacy. And he argues that South Africa has demonstrated with things like its application to the International Court of Justice over Gaza, a commitment to those international legal and other norms and standards which are essential to bind the multilateral system. So he argues that actually South Africa does have that kind of influence and power. It still perhaps punches a little bit above its weight. And certainly with our current president, who has won respect at international level, there is that opportunity, complex though it will be.
So if we want to marshal this coalition of middle powers, then, Richard, what is the first move here? What should our first concrete demand be of those other players?
Well, an excellent question. And it will play out, I think, in different ways. It won't play out with a big announcement. There will not be, in my article I talked about a sort of M10, 10 middle powers that cut across the world, global north, global south, binding their commitments to certain action points. It's not going to be a big announcement, but it could find effect and expression in more subtle ways, where agreement is found behind the scenes amongst important middle power countries that then step up and stand up to the great powers and say, stop messing around. We need you to accept responsibility for important decisions in relation to a whole range of things, but especially in the terrain of finance and debt and capital allocation, because it's where money goes that matters most to combating the big problems.
Help me understand the geopolitical puzzle here. If we're going to embark on that road, does that not put us in conflict potentially with our BRICS partners?
Well, the BRICS partners are critical to this because they bridge the great powers, China and Russia, but also the middle powers, South Africa and Brazil, with India as this sort of mezzanine level that I've referred to in between. And clearly there's a huge amount going on. Whilst preparing for this a few minutes ago, I saw a very interesting photo that Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, put on his Twitter account, showing a photo of him and Putin in a car discussing things. So there are interesting shifts going on and interesting relationships that are occurring. And I think the BRICS countries, including the expanded BRICS countries, with all of the interesting members of that expanded BRICS arrangement, have an important part to play in this. But they will have to find like-minded partners in the global north. And that's where it's going to be complex, because you can take a middle power like, let's say, Australia or Canada, who will be, I think, very anxious about being seen to be perhaps in bed with a BRICS country that might include Iran, and the links in that direction. So great care will have to be taken with this. You're absolutely right. And BRICS will be front and center of this. The other factor, of course, is everyone talks about this as being the first African G20. And there's sort of rhetoric around that. But as yet, it's not clear whether what emerges from this G20 will have positive impact for African economies. That remains to be seen. A lot of work has been done in the various working groups and ministerial task forces and so on. But in the final run-in to the summit in November over the next 2 or 3 months, that's where the road hits the rubber, as it were, and where the traction will have to be found in terms of the policy recommendations that those various groups have made.
And Richard, within the diplomatic game, we also know that none of this will be achieved without partnership. So within that list of countries that comprise the middle group, the middle powers, is there a natural ally that South Africa would need to lean on?
So it's been very interesting in the last few months since the infamous Zelensky meeting in early March, when he was humiliated by Donald Trump in the Oval Office. There was an immediate realization that has sunk in even deeper since by European powers that the United States, certainly at the moment, is not a reliable partner. And so they have started to realign and to recognize that they must reset relations with other players in the global arena. And in fact, quite soon after that meeting, there was the annual meeting between the European Union and South Africa. And what emerged from that was a very different tone and set of agreements in relation not just to development aid, but how the two parties would relate to one another, a much more strategic arena. And my friend, Professor Carlos Lopez, who's a major influential thinker on these sorts of issues, has published a book towards the end of last year called The Self-Deception Trap, is the title of the book, in which he says that the European Union and Africa have been deluding themselves for many years in terms of their development aid relationship. And he says it's nonsense. It must be reset based on common strategic issues. You define those interests first, and then you decide who will pay for what. And I think that's the world we're entering into. Some people call it a post-aid world, in which development aid is reduced greatly, and countries have to partner on a different basis.
A lot of this is going to take delicate negotiation and a lot of nuance, as you've already suggested. Is there the danger that the delicacy of diplomacy that you're talking about, Richard, is simply going to be trampled over by a country like the United States, which is playing by a completely different set of rules?
There is that danger. And one of the interesting features of the G20 is that it's supposed to operate with a so-called troika of 3 countries working together at the helm of the G20. And the 3 are supposed to be the predecessor G20, which in this case is Brazil, the current one, South Africa, and then the next one, the United States. We're supposed to hand the baton of G20 leadership and the presidency in November to the United States. There's huge uncertainty about the role that the US is playing. It's not clear if Trump will attend the summit. It's not clear to what extent the United States will be a constructive partner in these discussions. It blows hot and cold, much like Mr. Trump himself. So that diplomatic delicacy, as you put it, is going to be a defining feature of the next period. It was interesting to note, however, that the meeting of finance ministers in Durban in July was relatively successful. It reached agreement on a range of issues that was quite surprising, actually, in many ways, and people were surprised that there was no blockage there. So that was encouraging, and I think if similar ministerial meetings, of which there will be many over the coming weeks, the next couple of months, it's the bottleneck moment for any G20 when it all kind of starts to come together, directed towards a leadership communique that will be agreed upon or not in November. So it's a critical period. If the momentum of the finance ministers meeting can be sustained, and if South Africa can continue to walk this diplomatic tightrope, then maybe we can have a very successful G20, notwithstanding the uncertainty of the United States.
Richard, let me try and tether your argument then to the theme of South Africa's presidency, which is solidarity, equality, and sustainability. How do those 3 descriptors, which is obviously a guiding blueprint fit into the direction with which that we want to head in? Or are these all just, is it all just empty rhetoric, do you think?
Yeah, a brilliant question, Jeremy. I think usually those sorts of words are just buzzwords, essentially empty vessels, as you imply. Here they have greater meaning because they are words that are, in a sense, ideological. And I would support that idea by referencing Secretary of State Rubio's response to the first invitation of the year to him to attend a meeting of foreign ministers in Johannesburg in February. He declined to come, and he tweeted that he would not be party to what he called climate change and DEI nonsense. And he referenced the three words: equality, sustainability, solidarity. But if you get behind the skin of that, then these are three words which are really about this whole debate: multilateralism, global cooperation, norms and standards. Solidarity is a word related to multilateralism and international cooperation. Equality is about equality. It's about trying to level the playing fields, make the world a fairer, better place for everyone. And sustainability, of course, is about taking on the biggest issues, such as climate change. So these are important words, and how they play out through the different working groups and ministerial meetings and task force is going to be critical.
Richard, I enjoyed the use of your word, a sclerotic Europe, and just for people who need the medical definition, it's anyone or management or person that is rigid, unresponsive, and losing the ability to adapt, which I think is the perfect word. You're suggesting that Europe in this respect has also got an important role to play, and many of those countries would be mezzanine or middle powers, and the continent has to reset its relationship with Africa and the global south. Richard, what would a credible reset look like or include?
Well, essentially, it requires an equality of approach. And the buzzwords of equal partnerships has been around for a long time, but it's been observed or respected in the breach, I should say, meaning that in the end, European and other Western powers have pretended to treat their partners from the global south as equals, but haven't really done so because they've had the whip hand through the money. That's changing, as I mentioned earlier. So this post-aid world where the aid envelope is greatly reduced means that, and where geopolitical arrangements such as the transatlantic alliance between the United States and European powers have broken down. And so therefore there is a reset, a strategic reset about finding new interests that can bind countries and drive their relationships. That's really, I think, what's going on here. Europe has proved, I think, in recent times to be sclerotic, yes, so flexible and lacking backbone. And I think if that relationship is to be truly reset, it is going to require a recognition that the global north has been conducting itself with a huge amount of hypocrisy. Let's call it what it is, double standards. So the very selective application of international law and justice. Northern powers, European powers especially, want global powers and middle powers such as South Africa to step up and support them on Ukraine against Russia, but are not willing to accept the injustice that is going on in relation to Palestine and Gaza in particular and the genocide. And so it's going to require some really tough talk, and that reset will not be a technical reset. It's an ideological one. It's about recognizing what matters to global South powers and middle powers, as well as what matters to the West.
And if Europe doesn't shift, then, Richard, what's the opportunity cost for Africa? Would it be capital? Would it be leverage? Would it be access, or a combination of all of that?
Well, I think there's an opportunity cost for both. And I think this is the point. Europe is in a state of decline, I would argue. And if you go to Europe and spend time there, you can sense that morale is low, that there is not the sort of optimism that, despite everything, I think we see in the global south. The reason for that, frankly, is that in the global south, economies are growing. There are many challenges, of course, but actually things have been getting better. And certainly for the professional classes and the middle classes, life is getting better. And that fuels optimism. Whereas in the global north, and especially in Europe, it's the other way around. People are getting poorer, the cost of living the weakness in infrastructure, the lack of young people to do jobs, the declining, the concern around who will pay for pensions in that context is these are serious problems in the global north. And so they have to wake up to that reality, which I think is slowly happening, but maybe not fast enough. So that's the opportunity cost for Europe. The opportunity cost for Africa, if there's no reset, is that, yes, we will have to go it alone at a time when we still need help in terms of probably big tech and big finance. And so that shift in capital from global north markets to emerging market economies is still a number one priority, I would say.
Richard, the other issue I referred to in our introduction was the important work of the Sustainable Finance Working Group. It's been, as I mentioned, in South Africa, pushing leadership development and how to unlock capital for emerging markets. Do you think that it's likely to land any real progress this year? And if so, what would constitute progress, do you think?
So the Sustainable Finance Working Group is almost a microcosm of what we've been talking about for the last few minutes, which is that it's kind of caught in the vortex, the crosshairs of these geopolitical kind of debates. There is talk, for example, of the United States closing down this working group, even though it is well respected, even though it's the working group that's been around for a long time and has achieved a great deal over the last 10 years or more in terms of redefining what is sustainable finance and where finance must go. We, as the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, did a 2-day piece with them in June in Cape Town, and it was notable that there were, I felt, a breath of fresh air. There was a willingness from countries from the global north and Europe to talk in a different way to their partners from Africa and from other emerging market economies. There was a lot of agreement. There were some tough conversations, but there was a lot of agreement. And there was a sense of, we have to raise our game. We have to make progress on the big issues, such as the cost of capital, such as very inadequate assessments of risk in emerging market economies and in Africa. Things like that, how to get finance for infrastructure in cities that are growing fast around the African continent, these kinds of issues. And so I'll be watching that group with great attention to see if they can come up with really solid, practical, granular recommendations that can get traction, get the support of middle powers, and make their way through to the final communique in November.
And the only way I'd suggest to you, Richard, that you're going to achieve that traction if there is better alignment between the B20 and the Sustainable Finance Working Group so that capital flows follow policy. But easier said than done, I imagine.
Yeah, the B20, the Business 20, is a very important grouping. And in a way, I think what you're suggesting, and I agree with you, if business and financial institutions through the B20 can reach agreement alongside the kind of state-oriented part of the G20, that would be a big win. It may be a necessary win, in fact, to get that traction. I would agree with that. And the B20, well, it's a delicate moment. The B20 working groups, task forces as they're called, there are 10 of them, have just concluded their work. And what they will be doing over the next few weeks is socializing their recommendations, what they call the advocacy phase. So we all need to pay attention to that. We'll have to see what lands and what doesn't. We'll have to join the dots between the different task forces, between things like infrastructure finance, just energy transition, trade, and so on. And that'll be fascinating to watch. And it'll be really interesting to see what emerges from that and to what extent there is that traction that, as you say, is necessary.
Is it a bridge too far when South Africa flags inequality and debt relief as key priorities? It's going to be difficult, surely, to achieve a serious outcome in that respect.
It's going to be very challenging. And whereas India and Brazil, two preceding G20 presidencies, had very clear, I think, strategic agendas with regards to those kind of big macro issues, we didn't really have that, to be perfectly honest. And South Africa was a little late in its preparation for the G20. It's been sort of playing catch-up ever since. I think it's doing a good job despite that, and it's been helped by the fact that Brazil and India before it had set a really ambitious strategic agenda. But it now needs to put its own legacy on here. And the problem is, it may be that the best it can achieve is simply holding the G20 together in the context of the big elephants trampling the ground. And if it can do that, that would be a win. Keeping multilateralism alive through this G20 will not be an unimportant victory, in fact. If it can add to that some important agreements across the world on key issues, such as cost of capital and debt, that would be an even bigger victory. I'm sure that people behind the scenes, I hope they are playing out the scenarios. They should be preparing for almost anything that could happen over the coming 3 or so months. And they need to play those scenarios through. They need to game them. They need to be set for every single possibility that might arise. And if they can have that kind of diplomatic dexterity, this G20 could be a great success.
And just a final question, Richard, and you're going to curse me for this one, but if you were drafting South Africa's closing chair summary, what verbs would you use to anchor it?
I would use words such as solidarity, international cooperation, a collective action, but I would also talk about equality between countries and within countries, and I would talk about ambition and urgency and scale.
Richard Calland, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Mandates and Megaphones. Let me say this in conclusion. As South Africa steers the G20 through turbulent waters, and you've heard about those turbulent waters, the questions that you've raised, I think, Richard, go way beyond diplomacy. They've, as we've discussed, touched on capital credibility and the kind of world order that is going to shape our collective future. You said to me a little earlier, this was a critical event at the end of the year, and I think you've put your stamp on that. So thank you so much indeed. Mandates and Megaphones brought to you by Standard Bank. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Until next time, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.